Hello, all. Welcome again. Dr. JC here, week 2. This week we're going to be looking more specifically at what historian Bernard Bailyn refers to as the peopling of British North America. And while we'll work in some First Nations or Native American history here as well, the focus is going to be on European settlement, white settlement, into the various regions that will make up these 13 colonies that will become part of the United States. That'll be the central focus. Before we do a brief but deeper dive into the 4 regions of what will be British North America, at least those areas that will eventually comprise the United States, whether they be New England, these middle colonies, the colonial Chesapeake, or the colonial South, I'd like to start first with some commonalities as it relates to British settlement more generally. With the exception of colonial Georgia, Oglethorpe's Georgia, we'll talk about that here in a minute, all other colonies that are established along the eastern seaboard of what will be the United States were established by the British for profit. These were business enterprises. Thus, from the start, capitalism is embedded in this endeavor, which is colonial British settlement of North America. Now, the investors that backed many of these enterprises, these colonies, through royal charters, they get these royal charters from the king. Well, they'd hoped to find gold and silver akin to the wealth that was being amassed and transported by the Spanish from South America back to the Old World. Early settlers and the leaders of these expeditions will find that Yukon Cornelius ain't having any luck here, all right? The gold and silver just ain't here, bro. Naturally, however, if you're an investor, you don't care. I threw money out here, I expect a certain percentage of return, figure it out. And the settlers and the leaders of these settlements will figure it out. And they'll come to quickly understand that North America is full of riches waiting to be extracted. And in the process of figuring out how to make coin out of this wilderness, or as Winston Churchill might say, how to create cosmos out of chaos, there is something that emerged quickly across all 13 colonies amongst the early settlers and the leaders of these settlements. And it was the idea of and understanding of this concept of being an American. That yes, while we're here as British colonial Americans, this is way more American than it is British. And if the folks back in London town think that we can recreate New York out of old York, they need to leave their cubicles and come to this place, because it ain't happening. So almost immediately this sense of American, even though British colonial American, emerges. And this will be shared up and down the eastern seaboard amongst those settling, whether it's in colonial New England all the way down to the colonial South. Important to keep in mind. Before we do a quick dive into each of these different colonial regions, whether they be colonial New England, the middle colonies, the colonial Chesapeake, or the colonial South, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about First Nations or Native Americans here. As mentioned in week 1, there was conflict between First Nations here. Not all quote-unquote red-skinned peoples got along. And as a result of that, when Europeans come into contact with them with superior technology, firearms, they are more than willing to engage with and trade with European settlers. And why not? If they can provide you superior technology that you can go whack your enemy with, I'm all for it. Remember too, when white settlers, European settlers first hit the shores, they're outnumbered by red-skinned peoples in the thousands. So the idea of a threat as much as potential asset isn't there, at least initially. Important to understand too is that there was this huge network of intra-First Nations trades that was taking place as well, long before European settlement. Copper from places like the Keweenaw Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula of what would be Michigan, Uperland, would find its way all the way to the East Coast in SEC land today, down in Georgia. So it was a huge network of trade that was already embedded within red society before white folks arrived. And thus, if we look through a medical lens and think about the impact of red and white contact, the idea that native peoples don't have immunities to European disease, you can see how easily this could spread amongst various First Nations groups. If there's an active trade from the eastern seaboard to the Great Lakes, you can trade stuff that you don't know you're carrying either. The invisible diseases that can wreak havoc and devastation to your society. Lastly, it's important for us to understand and recognize that there was an active slave trade in Native American peoples ongoing before European contact as well. And while we've already talked about red-skinned labor and how Europeans might come to frown upon that, do understand that there was an active supply of able-bodied individuals that could be sold to European entrepreneurs because of the conflict between native peoples that existed prior to that contact. Therefore, just like on the west coast of Africa, like the Kingdom of Dahomey there, if I can trade my prisoners for European arms to increase my power and status, I'm all for it. And you'll see the same thing take place here in the quote-unquote redskin world as well. All right, so let's jump into each of these regions briefly, and I'll just give you some salient points that I want you to associate with each of these regions. And at the same time we're going through each of these regions, I want you to consider how the underpinning labor and culture of these regions develops and how that might have an impact on future events in American history. So let's start with the colonial Chesapeake. The gold that will be found in the colonial Chesapeake, and when we talk about the colonial Chesapeake, we're talking about Virginia and Maryland, all right? Gold that will be found there is tobacco. While King James may have referred to this as the noxious weed, folks back in England, especially in London town, with the help of some interesting marketing, soon found the use of tobacco as a social status. Only the rich perhaps could afford it. As a result of that, a huge demand for the product back in England. There were a couple problems associated with tobacco, however, in the New World, especially Virginia and Maryland. Number one, it robbed the soil of nitrogen, and therefore if you kept trying to plant the same thing in the same spot year over year, it wasn't happening. You needed more land. Where was more land? To the west. Who owns that land, however? First Nations folks. You see the conflict coming there, right? That's problem number one. Problem number two was the environment. Europeans succumbed to disease, malaria and such in the New World, to the point where almost 90% of society's initial settlements were dying. So unless you're a really great marketer, hey, come on to this new cool place, only 9 out of 10 of you is going to die. How do you get people to come there? Well, that's when they came up with this headright system. Essentially established as a sweetener to promote immigration into the New World. The headright system was basically this. Any individual could purchase a headright. That was the equivalent of roughly 50 acres of land per head. Therefore, if I'm from London, stuck in this crappy apartment with a family that doesn't really have any name that would be recognizable in English or European society, in other words, I'm not going anywhere. We're not moving up. Maybe I'll take a shot in the New World. And if I travel with my family of 4, I'm not great at math, but 54s is 200 acres. Hell, I could be frickin' king. And thus the headright system was a way to get folks to come from the old world to the new. That's a very generalized version of it. As a result of this headright system, it's important to recognize and understand in the colonial Chesapeake, most individuals that were brought to work here were indentured servants and the first of the African slaves to arrive in 16 and 19. So we have a tobacco plantation economy worked largely through individuals that have willingly given up rights to their own labor or forcibly given up rights to their labor. And thus in the colonial Chesapeake, you have this haves versus have-nots society and culture that develops here, where the vast majority of people can't pay their way there or are forcibly brought there, and a select few that have control of land and the economy. In colonial New England, things will be a little bit different here. And while the stories of the pilgrims coming to the New World to escape religious persecution from the Old World is importantly well known already, what is perhaps less well known but equally important is the fact that the vast majority of these individuals that did come into colonial New England were from the middle class in the Old World. These are individuals that paid their own way, and therefore a concept of free labor, meaning individuals could freely negotiate for the best terms of their employment, was embedded in this society, clearly drawing a distinction from the colonial Chesapeake, where individuals didn't have the ability to negotiate for their own contract or their own labor. Another important aspect to associate with colonial New England is that was a self-governing charter here, a little different than a royal charter. And that's when leaders of the initial New England settlement arrived, they quickly recognized that we're going to have a much better chance of making it if we go it together rather than go it alone. And thus established what we might call a social compact, meaning that all individuals are going to come together, they're going to negotiate what is probably the best terms to govern society, what laws will govern society, and that while each of them may have to give up some individual liberties, it's for the betterment of the society as a whole. And thus what we see posited in colonial New England is that the king of the land will be the law. So a new king in a new world here. Now, before jumping briefly into the middle colonies in the colonial South, I'd be remiss if I didn't hearken back to some earlier comments about natives perhaps not fearing European colonists as a threat simply because of the volume of numbers. And I mentioned that initially native peoples far outstripped that of the number of European settlers. That will change over time, however. And this great migration that takes place into colonial New England is an example of that. You're going to see thousands of white settlers start to pour into the New World in the middle decades of the 1600s. At the same time, European diseases are going to start to ravage native societies. So native numbers are going to decline precipitously. At the same time, European numbers will increase equally as precipitously. And eventually it's going to cause native peoples to put aside their old animosities with one another and band together. We'll see this take place in future lectures. Now, rather than do a deeper dive into each one of these middle colonies, whether they be New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or Delaware, I'm just going to talk about the region more generally. Perhaps unsurprisingly, its position in the middle of those New England colonies to the north and east, and the colonial Chesapeake to the south, will make this region of British colonial America a mix of both those two other regions. And by mix, I'm talking more specifically about the labor and mixed economy in the form of industrial and agricultural output that will take place here. There'll be a mix of individuals that have paid their way to come here, like colonial New England, but also sizable numbers of indentured servants and a sizable slave population that takes place here in the middle colonies as well. Kind of a mix of New England and colonial Chesapeake. What is different here is the diverse nature of these middle colonies. It really is the most diverse region of the four British colonial regions in North America. Much of that diversity comes from other European settlement, like New Sweden and the New Netherlands. Both of those countries largely settled in the Delaware Valley into Long Island. New York was previously New Amsterdam. It was a melting pot. Thus, European immigrants come into the New World. They're going to land on Long Island and in the Delaware Valley and make their way west, hence the diverse nature of these middle colonies. Geography also favored the middle colonies. Two of the four principal cities in colonial British North America, Philadelphia City and New York City, happened to be in the middle colonies as well to expedite trade. The other two cities happen to be Boston and Charlestown, so let's go to the colonial South next. Before talking about North Kakalaki, South Kakalaki, and Georgia, North and South Carolina and Georgia, which make up the colonial South, I want to do a little recap here quickly as it relates to culture and custom around labor in the other regions. While colonial New England will largely settle on free or wage labor, the middle colonies generally more tending towards the wage or free labor. The colonial Chesapeake generally tending more towards unfree labor. The colonial South will decidedly be all about unfree labor, all about a slave society. While colonial Georgia, Oglethorpe's Georgia, will actually start as a philanthropic experiment without the institution of slavery. It's the only British colony that won't have slavery, Georgia, believe it or not. That will quickly crumble, largely because of the wealth, power, and status that comes from plantation slavery in places like South Carolina. As we'll see in weeks ahead, South Carolina is a central component of the early American history story, and it's because of the power and wealth that comes from slave plantations. Much more on that in weeks ahead.